started out, I grew up in Philadelphia, and my ambition was to be a really good basketball player. And while ignoring the fact that I was born into a family of two very serious, important women painters, my mother, Gertrude Fisher Fishman, and my aunt, Razel Kapustin, who studied with Siqueiros in New York, was a founding member of Artist Equity, a communist, did a mural for the WPA, studied with Barnes at the Barnes Foundation, but had no formal education as a painter, other than those brief encounters. My mother also didn't have a formal education. Neither of them went to college. My mother studied with Violetta de Mazia at Barnes and with my aunt, briefly. And I somehow ignored the fact that there I was, situated in the most extraordinary place. I won't tell you the accident that happened that got me to go to art school, which I've talked about a lot because it's so curious. But anyway, I ended up going to the Philadelphia Museum School in 1956, and I've been painting ever since. My first painting class was so clear, became so clear to me that I wanted to be a painter, and that's all I wanted to do. And so I've been painting, I've been doing painting, that's what I've been doing, teaching, etc. Some of the themes that have gone through my work, I would say, are certainly the grid. This is an example from, I believe it's 1970. And you'll see the grid coming up in most of the slides that I'm going to show you. The other important influences were certainly my studying at Tyler School of Fine Arts, which was a true academy, where I learned how to grind paint and make Flemish underpainting and a fresco, etc. And so I hated it because I wanted to paint like Franz Klein. That was my true ambition. Because I think because Franz Klein was such an athletic painter, it appealed to me tremendously. And I was at the Philadelphia Museum School for 1 year and was seduced by a woman and ended up having my parents end my year there. I went to Tyler School of Fine Arts, which I would say was a hotbed of lesbianism, which my parents, of course, didn't know. One of the things that's kind of important about my queerness is the freedom I had and the fact that I straddled genders in a way. And so I could identify with Titian and Klein, even though it was sort of ridiculous on a certain level. And when we had art history classes, there were no women. At that time, there were none, 56, 57, 58. I had a healthy education with Hermann Gundersheimer, who introduced me to pre-Renaissance, Renaissance, and Mannerist art. And all of those things have been crucial to me. And so in addition, before I go on and sort of go through these paintings with you, I fell in love with Soutine, who was a Jew, came from someplace in Lithuania, and painted the way I wanted to paint. And oddly, Mondrian, at the other end of the spectrum, who was introduced to me by a very important teacher, Carl Sherman, who taught a color design class at the Philadelphia Museum School. And it was, I didn't like Mondrian at the time. I didn't like Cézanne at the time. But those are my great loves, aside from Marilyn Monroe. When I got involved with the women's movement and the gay and lesbian movement, I abandoned painting, and I decided that I wanted to have all the options to do whatever came my way. Instead of following a tradition that was was very male, I decided to just make whatever I wanted to make. I had met Eva Hess just a couple of years before she died, and was very impressed with what she did. And so I decided to do some sculpture, and the grid, of course, stayed. This is rubber, and it's sort of a sort of bowing towards Eva Hess. Sometime in the 70s, I got included in a Whitney biennial, and it brought up the most incredible rage in me. God knows, I don't want to go into it too much, but I found myself unable to do anything but make these paintings about my anger and the anger of all the women I knew, my friends, my colleagues, Marilyn Monroe, and I'm sure this is meant for Marilyn. I fell in love with Marilyn when I was 14, when I saw a movie called Don't Bother to Knock with Richard Widmark, and I couldn't understand why I was so mesmerized by this woman. I kept thinking, it's because she's such a good actress, probably. And the interesting thing about that, for me, was when I had other choices in my life, I could always go back to the passion that I had for Marilyn and think about what I wanted in my life and not what I was willing to accept. And so Marilyn was extraordinarily important. In these paintings, there were 30 altogether. They refer to different women. This was for Paula Cooper and Paula Webster and Paula Costanza. And it was my putting myself in their shoes in a way and thinking about what their anger was like. And a lot of times it was pretty accurate. I started giving the paintings away, and then I realized that was a mistake, that they needed to be together. And this is the group, part of the group at PS1 with Olinda Banglis on the floor. Good company. In 1988, I accompanied a friend of mine who was a painter and collector back to Auschwitz, where she had been for quite a long time, and to Terezin. And I went along with her to sort of help her, I thought. And what happened is that it was experiencing it in a very basic way, and it changed my life, it changed my work. This is a photograph in Terezin, and that's a photograph from Auschwitz. And what I did instinctively when I was there was to walk into this, what was, I found out later, called the Pond of Living Ashes. And it was where the crematoria had been emptied. And I didn't know that, but I walked in and instinctively took a handful of the soil and put it in a Kleenex box that I had and took it home with me. And when I got back, there were a number of options, and one of them was I thought I'll plant a tree. And a friend of mine, the novelist Bertha Harris, said, don't plant a tree. Everybody plants a tree. Make a painting. And so I got some beeswax and a mortar and pestle, and I ground the soil into all the colors I used and made a series of paintings, which I titled, with titles that had to do with the holiday of Passover, which was celebrated in the camps. So each one of these, and I'm just showing you a few, have that soil, and this is bitter herb. Haggadah, and then back to the grid after a number of years. This is 1992. It's called Valles Marineris. The only difference in this particular grid and the ones that followed was I used paint rollers to make it. And they were freehand paintings. I'm sort of jumping around a lot because I wanted to show you a range of things. This is from 1990, a painting called Beast in the Jungle. And this painting, aside from being the title being a Henry James story, mainly had to do with the Soutine painting and the Rembrandt painting of the side of beef. The grid comes up again. This is 94. And this painting was made with an oyster knife. I mean, that whole grid was carved out of dry paint. It's amazing I didn't go through the canvas, which I do sometimes, and in this case I didn't, but it's actually one of my favorite paintings. Blonde Ambition. One night I was in the country watching television, and, you know, Madonna I'd never seen Madonna before, and I was very taken with her being such a tomboy and coming off of Maryland. I mean, she wasn't a Maryland, she was like a street kid. And anyway, so this is sort of an homage mostly to Maryland, but by way of Madonna. During 9/11, I happened to have been in my studio, which was over on between 10th and 11th, and my friend Donna Nelson and I watched the buildings collapse, and I found it very hard to think about painting, but I started, 6 months later, working on paintings on paper, and then some paintings, which had totally to do with this experience. And this drawing and this painting called Then both reflect that steel armature that was sitting in the middle of the debris for so long and reproduced in the New York Times, et cetera. And I did it very unconsciously, which is the way some abstract painters work, and certainly I do. The title of this painting is Rock and Ruins, and it actually comes off of a title of a Van Gogh painting called Rocks and Ruins. The reason I put it in, aside from the fact that I like it a lot, is that it is one of the examples of a grid that's sort of all over the place. It's a grid that's got a lot of calligraphy, but it still remains a grid, essentially. I mean, my interest over the years have been with Chinese calligraphy, Chinese glass, Chinese scholars' rocks, among other things. And they sort of enter my paintings a lot. The scholars' rocks had a big impact on me, partly, I think, because I spent a lot of time at Tyler being a sculptor and wanting to be a sculptor, but because of the fact that I had to travel an hour and a half each way to get to Tyler and only spent 1 year there, there was no way that I could do sculpture, so I devoted myself to painting. This is called All Night and All Day from 2008. By the way, most of these paintings are large. There are some smaller ones that I've included. And when I say small, they could be 8 by 10. This is called Line Drive. There are a number of I used to pitch hardball for the boys' team, and of course I haven't done it for years and years. But the experience of doing that taught me a lot about making a mark and the physicality of being in a acting within a rectangle. And there are a couple of paintings that have baseball titles, and this is one I particularly liked from 2010. This painting is called Gaucho, also from 2010, and I included it because I was named after my grandfather, who I never met, Louise Fishman, who was a Talmudic scholar in Russia who went to Argentina and became a gaucho. Came to Philadelphia to rejoin his family, whom he had sent to Philadelphia to rejoin other relatives, and became a butcher and died of tuberculosis before I was born. So I was named after him. And someone who was writing about me said something like, I painted like a Talmudic scholar on a bucking bronco. I kind of like that. This is a very small painting, 14 by 11, called Speaking to the Rose. I would say that the majority of these paintings are oil on linen, and some with very little medium. If I use medium, it's stand oil. Zero at the Bone, 70 by 60. This is one of the many paintings that I have titled after Emily Dickinson's poetry, which I haven't been reading her poetry for a little while, but I used to read it all the time, and especially in the studio. You can probably see that I tend to dig up the surface a lot, that I use knives, different kinds of painter's tools, not artistic painter's tools, but every imaginable kind of spatula, etc. And I scrape a lot and get all the way down to the linen, sometimes to my chagrin, through the linen. This is called The Mirror of Ink from 2011. And my choices about these paintings are, it just so I chose like 70-some paintings, and then I decided to go through and just pick out a few that I wanted to talk about. And so I still ended up with 50-some paintings, but they're mainly paintings that really interest me at the moment. 2 years ago, I went to Venice on a residency with my now spouse, Ingrid Nybo, and spent I was there for 2 months in an apartment, and I did watercolors and photographs. And I'm just going to show a few of the watercolors. There are millions of them, and books that I made. And then came back to New York and made paintings that were all about Venice. It was impossible to ignore what that experience was. And this is the group of paintings that I did. And I kept thinking, why is all this blue in here? And why am I painting? Why are they all over the place? Which, seemed like a departure. And it suddenly got to me. It was Titian, it was the water in Venice. And I just went with it. I mean, I really didn't have much of a choice. And this is called A Simple Pulsation from 2011, 60 by 80, which I showed at Cheim. I showed this group of paintings at Cheim Read 2 years ago. Serenissima, also in 2012. Assunta, 2012. Crossing the Rubicon, 2012. Two small black and white paintings that I did also in 2012, 16 by 12, and yeah, both 16 by 12. And these are very new paintings from 2013, which I painted after coming back from Denmark, which had a big impact on me. I'm married to a Dane who grew up and went to school in Denmark and taught me a lot about how the two oceans come together in Skane. This is called Kattegat, which is one of the oceans that comes from the right, I believe, when you're standing looking at. This is a very new painting called Skane, S-K-A-G-E-N, which is this place, which is the tip of Jutland, where the two oceans come together. And you can, I mean, I stood on the beach with an ocean, a wave coming from the left and a wave coming from the right, and it was very powerful. This, I believe, is the last painting. It happened to have been finished on 9/11, and it brought lots of change into the studio and into my head, and I titled it 9/11 Redux. So it takes a slightly darker turn. And I think that's all.